Recently, we learned about westward expansion in the United States. During westward expansion, many people were moving west to build new homes and new lives. Although automobiles had not been invented at this time, the steamboat was invented and the transcontinental railroad was completed, which made traveling much easier. In this domain, we are going to jump forward in time and talk about a different event in U.S. history. But first, I want you to recite the Pledge of Allegiance with me. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Liberty means freedom, and justice means fairness. These are things that were important to the people that fought for their freedom in the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. However, they themselves were keeping freedom from a large number of enslaved African people. Slaves are people who are forced to do difficult work for no wages or pay, and they are not allowed to make their own decisions about where to live or what they do with their lives. Do you think that someone who is not allowed to decide anything about their life and is forced to work for no money is really free? No. Many people realized that slavery was wrong, yet many of the colonies, especially in the South, continued to force people into slavery. Many people practiced slavery. However, as the United States continued to grow and spread further westward, many people in different parts of the country strongly disagreed about slavery. Slavery was allowed in some states, but not in others. Having different parts of the United States disagree about whether or not slavery should be allowed eventually led to a war. This war is called the U.S. Civil War, or the War between the States. A civil war is a war between two different groups within the same country. In this unit, we are going to learn about important events and important people related to the U.S. Civil War. In today's story, we are going to learn about a woman named Harriet Tubman. Harriet's nickname as a child was Minty, and in our story today, you will hear her referred to as Minty instead of Harriet. Before we begin our story, let's go over a few of the vocabulary words that we will hear. The first word is value. The value of something is its usefulness or importance. If a car drives well in the snow, it would have great value during winter months. A painting done by a very famous artist would also have a lot of value. But a broken pencil probably wouldn't have very much value. Take a minute to think of something that has lots of value to you. Slavery. Slavery is the practice of forcing people to work without pay as enslaved people and denying them the freedom to decide how to live their lives. Slavery was very unfair, since all people should have the right to be paid for their work and be free to decide where to work and live. Plantations. Plantations are large farms where crops are grown. There were many large cotton plantations in the South before the Civil War. Wages. Wages is money that is paid or received for work. For example, enslaved people were forced to do difficult work for no wages. Survival. Survival is the ability to continue to live or exist, especially when it is difficult to do so. For example, The polar bear relies on layers of fur for its survival in very cold habitats. Minty's eyelids were heavy. Her head bobbed up and down as she faded in and out of sleep. She pinched herself to try to stay awake, but the house was so quiet and calm. Even the tree frogs, crickets, and other creatures of the night had stopped their chirping and croaking. It seemed that all of Maryland was asleep at this late hour, except young Minty. At age 6, Minty should have been asleep too. Her body and mind cried out for sleep, yet she dared not doze off, for fear that she would not hear the baby crying. The baby was Minty's responsibility. She watched over the baby day and night, rocked him to sleep, kept him warm in his blanket, and sang songs to keep him happy. Minty would do anything in her power to keep him happy, for she knew that if he cried, she would be punished. And so, each time the baby stirred in his crib, each time he whimpered or moaned, Minty's heart raced. As soon as the baby cried out, even if he only cried for a moment, the baby's mother would get very angry with Minty. Do you think it was fair for the baby's mother to get angry with Minty when her baby cried? Can Minty always control when babies cry? Those of you that have younger siblings probably know that babies cry all the time, sometimes for no reason. This was the awful, painful reality in which Minty lived, because Minty was an enslaved African person. Even at the tender age of 6 years old, she was forced to work for no pay all day long, every day. And Minty thought she would be enslaved her entire life until she died. This was the terrible truth of slavery. Minty and other enslaved Africans like her had no rights or freedom. Minty would be forced to do the hard work given to her from sunup to sundown, providing great value to the plantation owner almost every day of her entire life. So remember, value means something that's useful or important. Very, very little of Minty's time would ever be her own to do with as she wished. This is what life was like for millions of people in the United States of America when Minty was 6. In fact, this is what life had been like for many people for a long time, long before Minty or her parents and even her grandparents were born. One night, Minty asked her mother how and why she and her family had become enslaved. "Well, your grandmother," her mother told her, "she came over the ocean on a great big ship. She came from a place called Africa. Many Africans are here now, enslaved in this land they call the United States." "Why did grandmother and other Africans come here?" Minty asked. "It was not their choice to come here from Africa," her mother explained. "Africans were captured by men with guns and other weapons who wanted to bring them to America to work in slavery. They were put on these ships against their will, and then they were brought to this country and sent to places like plantations, farms, businesses, or households to work." Remember, a plantation is a very large farm where specific crops are grown. That's why our life is the way it is. We do as we are told, and we do our best to survive. By this, Minty's mother meant they worked hard to keep their families as safe and as healthy as possible. Slavery is a terrible thing that has been used by many different groups of people throughout history, going back thousands of years ago. Minty's father and mother had 9 children, including Minty. But, like most enslaved Africans, the family did not live or work together all in one home. Minty's mother worked for a man named Edward Broadus. Minty's father worked for a man named Edward Thompson, whose plantation was down the road from the Broadus home. 3 of Minty's sisters were sent away to work for plantation owners in Georgia. Minty never saw any of them again. As her mother said, enslaved people did not have a choice or say in the matter. The plantation owners did whatever they had to do to make as much money as possible from their plantations and slave labor. Remember, enslaved people were not paid for their hard work. Since enslaved people were not paid, plantation owners, small farmers, business owners, and others who used slaves made more money than they would have if they had to pay people to do the work. Because families of enslaved Africans often could not live together or were separated, they depended on the community of the enslaved Africans on the plantation. Mothers and fathers would take care of children who were not their own. Enslaved Africans helped and supported each other as communities by looking out for each other and working together. In this way, they could be strong together, despite the fact that they were enslaved. Although life was hard for the enslaved people, this working together and helping each other contributed to their survival and made it better. So remember, survival means to keep living even when it's hard. Survival was definitely hard for these enslaved people, but they kept going. Where Minty lived, the enslaved Africans worked hard to perform many jobs that added value to the plantation. They took care of the horses and tended crops of tobacco, corn, and hay, plowing, planting, and harvesting. In the winter, they chopped wood, mended fences, and helped clear more land for farming. Many enslaved people were skilled at a trade. Some tended to the farm animals, and butchers preserved the meat. Weavers, spinners, and seamstresses were involved in the process of making clothing. Their skills were valued. Skilled carpenters constructed and repaired buildings and made furniture, and blacksmiths used iron to make and mend important tools for the life and work of the plantation. Many lived in shacks with dirt floors, had one set of tattered clothes and no shoes, and didn't have enough to eat. Most enslaved Africans worked out in the fields, performing the many difficult tasks involved in growing and harvesting the crops. They were known as field slaves, and they lived the hardest lives of all. They worked from early morning until late at night, often with no relief from the heat or rest from their hard labor. They always worked under the watchful eye of the overseers, people who kept watch over and directed the enslaved people. The enslaved people always worked under the threat of punishment. Other enslaved Africans worked in what was known as the Big House, the beautiful mansion belonging to the plantation owners. They did not have to work in the hot sun. They wore nicer clothes than the field slaves, and they sometimes had access to more food than the field slaves. In addition to daily cooking and cleaning, house slaves helped make butter, wash the household laundry, and care for the plantation owners' young children. That was Minty's job, which was why she was watching the baby at night. Just like those who worked in the fields, enslaved Africans who worked in the house worked hard. But, also like the people who worked in the fields, they helped each other a lot, and that made it less hard and less sad. Plantations, like the one where Minty and other enslaved Africans lived and worked, were common throughout Maryland and all of the states in the southern United States, or the South. The South, spelled with a capital S because it's a proper noun, we're naming a specific place. The South had rich soil and endless farmland. Those who owned the land could get rich by growing and selling tobacco, cotton, and other crops. Running a large plantation required many workers. There were no tractors or other machines to help in those days. The enslaved Africans working on a plantation contributed valuable skills and labor to the success of the plantation. Without the enslaved Africans, the plantation could not be run. They did many important jobs of all kinds. Even so, rather than hiring workers and paying them, plantation owners, who were white, forced people who were black to work for free in a life of slavery. The plantation owners thought that they could treat these African people this way because they looked different. Because of this difference in the way they looked, the plantation owners thought that they were better than the people they enslaved, even though that's not true. As enslaved people, they were not given any wages for the work they did on the plantations. Remember, wages means the money earned for doing work. Enslaved Africans were not given wages of any kind. Millions of Africans were taken from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to live a life in slavery. And the children of the enslaved Africans, children like Minty and her sisters and brothers, automatically became enslaved the very moment they were born. They would likely remain enslaved until they died. As Minty's mother explained, enslaved people did not have the choice to be free people. Or did they? Early on, Minty began to wonder whether it was possible to resist or fight back as an enslaved person. She wondered this because she had, in fact, seen her own mother resist the plantation owner's wishes. When Minty was young, Mr. Rodas arranged to send her brother Moses to a plantation belonging to another owner. Minty's mother had already seen 3 of her daughters sent far away to another plantation down south, and she was determined not to lose any more of her children. When Mr. Broadus came to fetch Moses to send him away with the other plantation owner, Minty's mother stood in the doorway and promised, "I will not allow any more of my children to be taken away." Something in her eyes must have scared Mr. Broadus that day, because he turned around and he never tried to send Moses or anyone else in Minty's family away again. This event gave Minty a shred of hope that one day she might be able to fight back and possibly win her freedom. Do you think that Minty will eventually be able to be free?